Okay, it's 1:30 in the afternoon, and I think let's kick off this webinar. It's a joint effort by the Eurosite Management Planning and Expert Working Group, MPEG, and the Eurosite Agriculture, Biodiversity and Climate, ABC Working Group. And normally it would have been Henk Zingstra, chair of the MPEG Working Group, who would have been hosting this meeting as chair and moderator, but Henk has been called away this morning because his daughter gave birth somewhat ahead of time, prematurely, to a daughter. And so Henk has rushed off to hospital to see her and has asked me to stand in for him, which I gladly do. Mother and baby are doing well, and it's a happy occasion for Henk in more ways than one, because it's the first time he's a grandpa. So I think congratulations are duly called for here. But now let's get on with the business. We have 3 speakers today, and we're going to do it as follows. After each speaker, I'll allow 5 minutes for questions which have to do with the content of the presentation. In other words, things that are not clear. So please don't keep remarks and comments of a more general nature to the end. And questions have to be put through the chat function. So if you want to ask a question, put it in the chat, and I'll read it out. And as I say, after each presentation, there'll be 5 minutes for questions. And at the end, we will have a more general discussion. So now the first speaker, which is Gwyn Jones. Gwyn, are you ready to go?
Thanks, Anton. Let's start sharing the screen. Are we okay there, Anton? Can you see the full screen?
Yes. Toolbars are gone. That's good.
Okay, thanks very much. So I've got 10 minutes to go through this, so I'll try to be brief. Apologies for that. I should thank the EA and Jan-Erik Petersen in particular for support and for inspiring this work, really, and also recognize my colleague Julia Wiese. So out of the, I don't know how many it is, habitats in Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive, 61 have been assessed by experts as needing some sort of agricultural management, at least over part of their range. That work was first initiated by Osterman a long time ago, and since EU expansion, Halliday and colleagues have done the work, and that's the paper that you should chase up if you're interested. Of course, there's a whole variety of them. These are just some of them. Mostly grasslands, but also heathlands, sclerophyllous vegetation, one woodland habitat, some coastal, etc. This is the an estimate of their area, the different habitats, different colours there, and you can see that grasslands dominate in the total. But yeah, if you add all the others up, then maybe grasslands is about half of it, and the area is of the order of 35 million hectares. That's what it seems to be, and that's about the area of Germany. So we're talking about quite a large area on the European continent. The EEA gathers together data from the Article 17 reports, and this is some of it. So these agricultural habitats, they're usually in worse condition than other habitats. That's the top graph. And the trends are usually poorer than other habitats. That's the bottom graph. So they're things of concern. And if we think forward from the Habitats Directive to potential nature restoration law, then of course the Habitats Directive concerns itself mostly with the fate of these habitats in designated sites, although the member states have to report on their wider fate. And so you can imagine that any nature restoration law would be particularly concerned with these priority habitats amongst all its other targets. So we've been asking a rather simple question, rather obvious question. Most of the Halliday habitats are pastures rather than meadows or some other sort of land and some other sort of agricultural management. And so we've asked the obvious question then, well, if the Halliday habitats are said to need livestock, how many livestock do they need? And we seem to be the first people that have asked this question, even though it seems really quite important for policy. So obviously we have to estimate this, and we have to do it in a sort of dirty sort of way, but some information is better than none, I think. So what we've tried to do is estimate the total livestock requirement in livestock units, and that can be per biogeographical unit, per habitat, per country, whatever. And we're doing that by multiplying the extent of the habitat by the grazing need of the habitat, as we call it, so the livestock unit per hectare. And we're using the Article 17 reports. These are reports that the member states have to provide every now and again for the Commission. We're using that as the source of the extent information. And the grazing need, we're asking experts. So we're trying to get them by habitat, by geographical region, the answers. And that means that we don't necessarily have ones in every country for every habitat, but hopefully we'll cover the habitat somehow. So if we look at the two sources of data, they both have their weaknesses. So the quality of Article 17 reporting, even though it's a statutory requirement, is really mixed. So some member states, they are honest about the uncertainty, and so they have a maximum and a minimum. Some member states are more confident and give a best value for at least some of the habitats, and some member states have a mixture in their reports. So we took all the reported data at face value, although we know some to be wrong. So Romania is a case in point. I'll show you that in a bit. If best values were available, we used best values. And we know that there's some data is missing, but really we couldn't address that. So Portugal is a case in point. There's a lot of data missing in Portugal. But yeah, our work wasn't, we don't have the capacity to address that. The Portuguese need to address it themselves. But with all those caveats, this is a graph of the area of hallowed habitats using either the best or minimum values as gained from the Article 17 reports. And some of this is fairly right, I think, and some of this is definitely wrong. So this is Romania here. You can see that Romania claims to have more of an area than Spain in terms of these habitats. And yet the permanent grassland figure for Romania is 4.4 million. So somehow we have these hallowed habitats, which are mostly grassland, covering 2.5 times the area of what they declare as permanent grassland. So we know that's wrong, but they declare their data as best value. They don't even say there's any uncertainty. So we might try to address that at some point. And then conversely, you can see Portugal there. PT, I don't know if my cursor, yeah, my cursor is moving. So Portugal there, you'd expect it to be something more like maybe Bulgaria or Austria. So we know there's data missing there. But that's a general picture, and yeah, in most cases, it's sort of there or thereabouts. In terms of uncertainty from the maximum minimum, the uncertainty is largely confined to very few habitats, actually. So these are meadow habitats, so lowland meadows and upland meadows, and most of that uncertainty actually comes from France. Yeah. So the uncertainty is rather limited in most cases on the habitats side, the habitat area side. In terms of grazing needs, experts estimates. Then of course we have this problem of, well, what do you mean by livestock units per hectare? I mean, if I use 10 livestock units for 10 days, isn't that the same as 20 livestock units for 5 days, or whatever? I think, well, okay, how am I doing it? So what we're asking them is, how many hectares could you manage with a given number of livestock units? So the agronomists might say, well, we could ask about dry matter hectares, dry matter per hectare, but most people don't seem to think in that manner. But we're trying to be equivalent to that. And of course, we're ignoring certain things that the animals might move to different habitats in different seasons, all these kind of things. We're just trying to get a broad estimate, and that's difficult enough. So we had experts in most countries, but not some major ones. So France, we didn't have, for example. And we tried to collate the ranges per biogeographical region, first as ranges and then as a single representative value. So this is just part of the table that we had. Obviously, we're not even getting into the grasslands by the time we get to the bottom of the table. But you can see for each biodiversity region where the thing exists, we have either a single value or a range, and the range is quite significant usually. And then for very few places, we extrapolate ourselves or interpolate it ourselves. These are the red ones. So here, the range that you result with, if you multiply things up, is much larger, of course, because the experts have a much larger range. So this is the difference per habitat. Yeah, so it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot of difference. And one of our challenges, I suppose, is to try and reduce that. But that's not easily said. That's not easily done. So, for example, if an expert says, well, it's 0.1 to 0.2, that's a really small difference in terms of life units, but of course it's double the amount. So there's a limit to what we can do there. We know we have some difficulties with meadow habitats. So there's 5 meadow habitats in the HALADA list that experts in some countries say, oh, they need mowing. And in some countries, they go even further than that and say they definitely don't need grazing. They need not to have grazing. But the reality, we think, is something different. So some countries, for example, in Germany, there's a lot on military ranges where clearly they're not mown, and yet experts say they need to be mown. And so there's some grey area there. So we're trying to look at that, but that's a small feature of the whole thing, really. Oh, 2 last slides of data. This is the results. So we know this is wrong. So okay, you're going to have access to these things. So please don't circulate it without saying that we know it's wrong. So for some countries, we are fairly confident. So Spain, I think we are fairly confident. But for Romania, for example, we know it's wrong. Sweden is another example where we know it's wrong, not because the Swedish data is particularly weak, but some of these habitats we know for some of their area in Sweden aren't managed by domestic livestock. They're either managed by nature, whatever that is, or by reindeer. And so that's wrong in Sweden. And in a case in Portugal, again, we know that the answer should be much bigger. So it's a considerable amount of livestock. And if we look at that compared to the total livestock in that country, then of course we see a pattern which is quite interesting. Again, we know some of them are wrong. So Croatia is another difficult country for us. The areas are small, but the uncertainties are large. But for example, in somewhere like Spain, yeah, okay, so we're talking about a number of animals which is equivalent to 40% of the current of the actual types of grazing livestock, we can say that way, not that they are grazing necessarily now. And so potentially, of course, it has implications for policy. 20% in Estonia, for example. Well, is there that amount of livestock grazing on semi-natural habitats in Romania? Maybe there are, maybe they're not. But it's not an insignificant question for agriculture and rural development policy if we can get these figures right. And so there's some obvious next steps. We need to compare the estimated needs with estimates of actual use. And if the 2 estimates are very, very different, then it has obvious implications for rural development agriculture policy, but also for this restoration law. How can we deliver the nature restoration law in simple numbers of livestock in terms of supporting policy, which needs to adapt maybe a huge amount to be at the scale that's necessary? And of course, that has spending implications. When we're doing this future work, then it's obvious that some countries need more attention. They have more challenges, but it's obvious also that some countries have really high importance. So Spain is one, but not the only one. And we know that colleagues in the Plataforma in Spain, for example, really struggle to get the support that's needed. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I don't know if it's less than 10 minutes, but yeah, if there's questions, I'm happy to help.
Thank you. Thank you, Gwyn. I don't see any questions for the moment. So I think then we can continue. We can always, at the end, there's a debate at the end. Okay, so the next speaker is going to be Walter. Walter?
Yeah.
Over to you now.
I'm here. So, can you hear me? Perfect. Then I will try to share my screen. I hope. Can you see it? Okay. Well, I'm asked to give a presentation. Actually, that I also did this spring during a Eurosite meeting in the Netherlands. So everyone who was there and who know my story can switch off, of course. But okay, it's again about how nature can be seen as an ally in solving socioeconomic issues. And because of the topic of this webinar, I focused this on the grazing part of it, as herbivory is one of the most important processes in our rewilding projects. And I've called my presentation Grazing Allies in Ecological and Socioeconomic Issues. Well, the content of my presentation is, I will start with our experience with grazing systems in the Netherlands. Then I will continue to other parts of Europe where we scaled up our experience. Then we got a request from the European Commission to set up a project, GrazeLife, to compare different grazing systems and management systems and their effectiveness for European targets on biodiversity and habitat, the GrazeLife project. And I will end my presentation with recommendations coming from GrazeLife towards both herd managers as authorities to improve actually the systems we have at the moment. Well, starting with our experiences in the Netherlands, starting where we started grazing projects, actually natural grazing, about 40 years ago, mainly actually focusing on grazing as an ecological process and the benefits for nature. A few years later, we had a first experience in our river areas where we developed a new vision on actually flood management to create more space for rivers in the floodplains and combine actually river dynamics and herbivory with flood management, flood risk protection, starting with a vision that was called the Plan Stork, which inspired in the end WWF to start their Living Rivers campaign, where river dynamics and large herbivores become an important part of the solution for several socioeconomic things, as I will explain later on. Well, you have to see it like this. So in this case, this is a picture of the Bordermeuse river between the Netherlands and Belgium. After some decades, it was originally just a 60 meters wide canal, which we broadened by superficial excavation to a braiding river of several hundreds meters wide, sometimes even more than 1 kilometer, and where large herbivores became an important part of the river system and managing actually forest regrowth, grassland restoration, but also by keeping vegetation more or less under control, keeping also the flow of the river intact, so that actually we create a safe river system, which proved itself 2 years ago by accommodation of one of the biggest floods we ever had in the Netherlands. In this area with rewilding, we didn't have any damage compared to 30 years ago, where we, in the original situation, we had billions of euros damage and we had to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people. And we solved it actually by superficial mining in combination with herbivory afterwards. So grazing and flood management as part of the same story. And here you see it in working in practice. So actually it's clay mining in this case that pays for the transition of agricultural land in the floodplains to nature. And immediately after the mining, we start bringing in large herds of horses, cattle, and also beaver, actually to keep the vegetation open so that the floods can freely flow through the floodplains, and we don't have to high up dikes. We just solve the problem with lower floodplains grazed by large herbivores. So here, flood protection, mineral extraction combined with grazing, and creating a very attractive landscape that attracts hundreds of thousands of people at the moment. So for this area, specific area where this picture comes from, we saw an increase of visitors from 50,000 to 1.5 million, and the large herbivores play an important role in that. Especially the horses, the free roaming horses, are often used in tourist information, brochures of tourist organizations to attract people to this area. So they play an important role in the new economy that's built up here in this area. But no, not only in tourism brochures, also in the brochures of real estate brokers, grazing plays an important role. And in the same area, we saw an increase of real estate value of 5 to 10% compared to areas without rewilding, without these herbivory. And that adds value to the landscape also for local communities that get more money, income for real estate taxes because of the attractive environment. So grazing is just more than an ecological process. It also helps a lot of socioeconomic issues and making creating a new economy in our rural landscapes. Yeah, the next one. Well, economically, this is maybe a small beer, but also our herds are growing with 20-25% per year. If possible, we try to bring those herds, these growing herds, to new areas, to areas outside the Netherlands in the end. But when there's no place to bring the animals to, then we have to slaughter the surplus of animals, and that brings an additional income for the herd manager of 20-30% of their income from meat from the wild, wilderness meat. You can say the only meat you can eat as a vegetarian because the animals have lived all their life in nature, born there, and have been fed with natural food. So quite a sustainable thing. But of course, apart from all these economic and social benefits, we should not forget about the ecological impact of large herbivory in our landscape. So the big picture you see here is a cornfield after 10 years with a lot of gradients between grasslands, shrublands, forest, young forest in the background. And we estimated almost 50% of our terrestrial biodiversity in Europe is direct or indirect related to herbivory. And that's all the species of grasslands, gradients to shrubland, forest, species of dung, of carcasses, of that all is direct or indirect related to the role of large herbivores. But also grazed landscapes, as you see on the right side here, are much more resilient when it comes to climate adaptation than the cultural landscape we knew from the past, which you see on the left side. So if you fly over Europe, you see almost everywhere these hard barriers between different parcels. There's every few hundred meters, there's a hard barrier for animals if they migrate through a landscape, where in a natural grazed system, both species of grasslands, of shrublands, of forest can find their way and move with climate change. And don't underestimate that importance. Climate change goes with 11 meters a day to the north. So in theory, every insect, every plant has to migrate with 11 meters a day to the north to keep pace with the climate change. And of course, then it's very important that the landscape is facilitating this. Well, having seen the experience in the Netherlands and the successes we had in 15 years' time, actually in the end also creating a national policy on floodplain restoration, large herbivores in the floodplains, and also everything that came with that. We got more and more interest from abroad, from other countries. First from Belgium, the UK, Germany, neighboring countries, but in the end also from Bulgaria, Croatia, Latvia. So what's going on in Europe? About 20 years ago, we realized for the first time actually that there's a big demographic change going on in Europe. More and more young people are leaving marginal landscapes where their parents had a small farm or were shepherd. They move to the big cities, and within 10 years, 85% of the European population will live in urban areas. And with their with the people, also livestock leaves the countryside. And here's the big challenge. We can't expect that millions of young people will return to the countryside, but we can replace the livestock with more or less free roaming herbivores. And by doing that, actually keeping the landscape as varied as it was in the past, but then in a more natural way. And that's actually why people are asking us to deliver herds of cattle, of horses, of deer, actually to replace the extinct livestock populations by free roaming, semi-wild feral herds of cattle and horses, and create, again, very attractive landscapes that could be a new economy for rural landscapes, like here in the Carpathians, in Romania, but also in Croatia, in Portugal, Spain, where we see that those landscapes grazed by free roaming animals become very attractive for wildlife watching. Photography is a very popular way of spending your holidays in abroad, and having these people spending their money on wildlife watching, eating, drinking in the area, that creates a new rural economy in some of our rewilding areas all over Europe. But not only that, and especially for the Mediterranean areas, it's important to see that the comeback of large herbivores can minimize the risk of large-scale wildfires. So you can imagine if landscapes are fully abandoned and there's an encroachment of bush and forest taking place, landscapes become very, very vulnerable for fires. And that's happening all over the Mediterranean part of Europe, and more also to the north. And large herbivores, they consume the fuel and they make fires more manageable. That doesn't mean that we will not have fires in the future, but the scale will be smaller than what we see at the moment. And actually that solution was already, so we find everywhere in South Europe rock engravings of 15, 20, 25,000 years old. It's all about large herbivores, cattle, horses, deer, bison. And actually the solution for these areas was already there, so to say. These animals play a key role in managing Mediterranean ecosystems. And by doing that, actually also contribute to, so by preventing wildfires, by eating the fuel for fires, and at the same time, by their dung, actually, and by dung beetles putting organic material in the soil, they prevent carbon emissions from fires. At the same time, they store carbon in vegetation and soil in a sustainable way. And that could be 2 to 5 ton carbon per hectare per year, depending on the situation where you are in the Mediterranean, which can add between 150 and 250 euros per hectare per year, looking at the current prices of carbon on the market. By grazing landscapes, creating very diverse vegetations with different diverse root systems, extensive grazing, natural grazing also causes very healthy and resilient soils that prevent erosion of slopes, like you see on the picture on the right side above. So in natural grazing situations, you will have much less erosion than in overgrazed situations. And the same counts for buffering of water. If you have diverse plant growth with diverse root systems, you will store more water in your surface than when it's just one species of grass or shrub or tree. And that's what's happening in rewilding areas, that you get more resilient soils, you store more water in your system, which buffers both in periods of heavy rainfall as in periods of drought, and helps also areas around nature reserves to be more healthy. And of course, having large herbivores structuring your landscape, it's much more environmentally friendly than doing it with machines. You don't need pesticides, you don't need fertilizers, you don't need oil for your tractors. These animals doing their business 24/7 without all these kind of additional fuel or chemicals. Not unimportant compared to the livestock we had in Europe, like in most cases it was, and especially in the Mediterranean areas, it was goat and sheep. Those herds of cattle and horses, bison, are much more predator-proof than the herds we had in the past. They know how to defend themselves. We have perfect examples at the moment from Croatia and Bulgaria, where we see cattle defending their calves by forming a circle at night, a circle of horns against wolves. But in that circle, we also find the horses back with their foals, and even deer we see hiding in those circles of cattle to hide for predators like wolves and bears in the area. So natural grazing also solves partly that problem. Well, despite all these advantages, we see that there's still a big challenge to get natural grazing on a scale in Europe. And that has a lot to do with the existing agricultural culture we have in Europe. And what we saw within rewilding Europe, that in some areas, farmers who want to rewild their lands, to want to work with more natural herds of horses or cattle, they got real problems with controlling authorities, with agencies that fined them for having shrubs on their land, for having trees on their land, for having herds that were not eligible for subsidies. So instead of being supported because they contribute to European targets on biodiversity and habitat and climate resilience, they are fined for not meeting the standard agricultural criteria. And well, we brought it to the attention of the European Commission, and then we got a project offered by the European Commission, which we called Graze Life, to actually show a wider audience what are the challenges at the moment in Europe to change from intensive farming and traditional agro-industry to a more natural forms of grazing. Well, as I said, it's a project. It was carried out between 2019 and 2021 on request of the European Commission. An important reason for them was, as I already mentioned, land abandonment in marginal areas and the loss of valuable grazing systems with livestock. Wildfire issue was a very important reason, I think, for the Commission to start this project. And our task was to compare different grazing systems and their effectiveness on biodiversity, climate adaptation, and other ecosystem services. That's what we did. And explicitly, the Commission asked us to pay special attention to natural grazing, as they expected a lot of benefits from that. So that's how we started, with in 8 areas spread over Europe. Here you see them on the map, with a scientific committee with members from Germany, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, with a PhD at Leipzig University that wrote some articles of our findings, and the whole project was coordinated by Rewilding Europe. The result of that project are, in the end, 45 recommendations. And to be honest, there was only a few of those recommendations that are dealing with the European level, because actually on the European level, most things are well written down. The regulations in Europe are quite good when it comes to land management that supported, of course, European targets on biodiversity and climate change. The problem is on the national policies and regulations. And really, most member states, they fail to take advantages from enabling European policies or even obstruct implementation of extensive grazing systems. And as the national authorities in the end are in charge of the implementation, here is the main problem of making a transition to more sustainable land management. And as I said, we have a lot of recommendations. Most are, as I said, on national policies. Actually, I split the recommendation in 3 categories. One is about national regulations that have to change. The second group of recommendations is about national regulations that are in principle good but are not well implemented. And the third category of recommendations is about herd managers that can improve their practices. But let's start with national policies that has to be improved. So, for example, you can already make use of derogations of European animal health regulation. You can already withdraw free roaming herds of water buffalo, cattle, horses, and bison from this animal health regulation. You can even register large extensively grazed areas for relaxation of microchipping horses or e-tagging calves. So a lot of trouble you get with animal health regulation you can actually avoid by taking specific herds or taking specific areas out of this regulation. And of course, that should be done without losing eligibility for CAP subsidies. That's still something that has to be organized on a European level. But for the rest, it's mainly the task of the national authorities. And this is maybe one of the most important one. At the moment, as I already said, as a farmer, you get fines if you have periodically flooded grazing areas, if you have reed and rush vegetations, if you have grassland under bracken, if you have scattered shrubs and wood pasture on your land. So while these things are mostly good for biodiversity, for habitat restoration, now they are often not eligible for subsidies in a national context, not on a European level. You're allowed to have all these vegetations on your land without losing subsidies, but on a national level, authorities are often fining you for having these vegetations on your land. And at the moment, it's actually, in the worst case scenario, we found out that when your government forces you to act against Natura 2000 or water framework directives, you can take them to court if they fine you for having these valuable structures on your land. But anyway, better to avoid that. And for example, create a team of national experts that in all those cases where national policies are in conflict with European policies, actually to organize an expert group that can judge in these situations what to do. And that group of experts could also help farmers and shepherds, especially in marginal areas in Europe where some people even don't know about the possibilities they have to get subsidies from European programs, help them to get in subsidies for the way they are doing their work at the moment. So there are a lot of small-scale farmers, shepherds in Southern Europe that actually are eligible for European subsidies, but they just don't know. And they could improve their business with help of consultants that connect them to existing systems. Then what actually I already mentioned, the importance of large herbivores for prevention of large-scale wildfires. It would be good if, especially in the Mediterranean areas, grazing fire brigades, as I call them, would be supported, for example, by specific subsidies, by creating strategic natural water resources so that herds have spread over the landscape sources to drink, and by having those natural sources graze larger areas. And still important in some areas in Europe to allow extensive livestock grazing in forests. There are, for example, in a country like Croatia, it's still not allowed to have livestock grazing in areas that have officially a forest status. Of course, that's something from the past where there was a lot of overgrazing and people want to avoid overgrazing. That's good. That's a good argument. But at this moment, with abundant landscapes, shrubs and forests everywhere, it would be good to skip that regulation and allow again extensive livestock natural grazing in those areas. And then another thing is, in some countries, as a landowner, you are not in charge of actually the hunting on your land, and so there are landowners that really want to go for natural grazing, with, for example, with deer, and have to see that that hunters are shooting the animals on their land. They have not the power to influence that. That should be changed in a lot of European countries. Also, as we saw for example, in Bulgaria, where we have a lot of support from local shepherds to increase wildlife numbers, because more wildlife means that deer, wild goats, chamois, and so on, they distract predators from livestock. So having more wildlife around helps also shepherds to protect their herds against wolves, for example. But it has to be regulated on national level. And another thing we found out in Graze Life, at the moment, in most countries, horses are seen equivalent to cattle. So one livestock unit of a horse is similar to one livestock unit of cattle. But in practice, you get more money from milk or from meat from cattle than from horses. And by considering both species at the same level, you see a shift from more and more people moving away from horses to cattle. And actually, that's really a pity, because mixed grazing, I will come back on that later, offers much more diverse ecosystems than grazing by just one species. Apart from that, compared to cattle, the methane emissions of horses are 3 to 4 times less. So having relatively more horses in your natural grazed areas also reduces the emissions of methane compared to just cattle grazing or other ruminant grazing. And then there is an opportunity to make use of European regulation on carcasses and leaving carcasses out in the field. At the moment, about 8 countries are doing this in Europe, but also for other countries, it should be more implemented, as it's really a source of biodiversity for, of course, for vultures, kites, and so on. But for thousands of insects, leaving carcasses in the field contributes to a much more rich nature than without them. And apart from the hassle you have with the transporting of carcasses, the damage you do in the area when you take out these carcasses, should be easier for, especially nature organizations, especially on remote places, to leave carcasses out in the field. Well, then there is also room to negotiate better practices in national regulations. And one of these things is, for example, to lower the threshold for operating mobile slaughterhouses in remote areas. Just like we have now for game slaughter, it should be easier to have mobile slaughterhouses in remote areas. For example, in the Danube Delta, it was a big issue. Instead of catching animals, transport them over hundreds of kilometers to official slaughterhouses. Be more flexible on this would helpful for a lot of organizations that want to start natural grazing on remote areas. Year-round grazing, still in some countries it's not possible, or it's possible, but it's not implemented. And also in the obligation to build a shelter, which could be a big cost for a landowner. There's no need for that if you use sturdy breeds. So allow year-round grazing, and if you do that with sturdy breeds, you don't need a shelter. Animals can easily survive themselves. And to help people, it's good to we have that list, to provide a list of suitable breeds for year-round grazing in different parts of Europe. Every region in Europe have its specific breeds that could easily graze year-round. Another thing on animal welfare, that, for example, in the Netherlands, it's already possible to shoot an injured animal in the field. By doing that, save the whole, avoid the stressful roundup of animals, the transport to a slaughterhouse. You just solve the problem in the field. And with a veterinary control, because you don't want to spread diseases in the air, just control the health of the animal. If that's good, leave the animal in the field. And well, that's an important thing. And apart from that, that's again a thing we found out in Bulgaria, a kind of frustrating practice, that veterinarian controls took place in summer, and the farmers had to bring back the animals to the farm when at the time that the animals have to graze up in the mountains. So instead of controlling them in winter, when the animals are at the farm, the controllers come at summer, and then the farmer has to catch the animals high up in the mountains, bring them to the stables, and do the controls. That all doesn't help extensive natural grazing. So those practices should change if we want to support more natural, sustainable grazing systems. And then as I already mentioned, we have an interesting thousands of hectare large grazing area on both sides of the Dutch-Belgian border. Large herds of horses and cattle cross the border here, but in both countries there are different laws, veterinarian rules. For example, it's not, on the regulations in Belgium are more strict than in the Netherlands. So then, if a herd crosses the border in winter in Belgium, then sometimes things are illegal. Where in the Netherlands it's just business as usual. So giving transboundary herds the same status again would help very much the practical implementation of grazing. Then we want to improve the practice of grazing among herd managers. As I said, use suitable breeds, animals that can calve foal without human assistance, that can deal with local climate conditions, that can extract enough nutrition from the natural vegetation and survive with the vegetation that's out in the field there, that are healthy, of course, that can show confident behavior towards people. Important if you have free access to these areas, you don't want to have animals that attack every visitor that enters the area. As I said, well-adapted maternal behavior is important, and I also mentioned that they should be able to fend off predators. And as I said, they are very well able to do that in mixed herds. So there are lists of these breeds for every region in Europe. Make use of that if you want to start natural grazing. Use social herds, very important, because herds, they create their own culture, their knowledge about where to go when a flood comes, where to find the right vegetation in different seasons of the year. And as I said, also good social structures with stallions, bulls help to protect against predators, and social groups have different behavior in the landscape. So groups of young stallions act different from harems. Large bulls create bull pits, stallions create manure markings in the field. Without social structures, you don't have that variety in landscape impact. And because of that importance of social herds, is also important for a herd manager. If he has to manage a herd, if he, for example, has to take out a group of animals, take out a social group, never disturb the social structure of the herd, never take out leading mares, leading stallions, just take out a social a group that, for example, of young bulls or a younger harem group that doesn't disturb the whole structure of the herd. Use mixed herd, as I said, it's again, large herbivores all have different grazing strategies, trampling strategies, strategies to protect their offspring. And the more different species, of course, indigenous species you have, the more diverse their impact will be on the ecosystem. So better to graze with bison and horses and cattle and deer than with just one of those species. They also facilitate each other in feeding patterns. So cattle with their grazing with their tongues mainly graze longer grass, and by doing that, opening up the vegetation for horses that graze with their teeth, the shorter grass pattern. As I said, horses will be defended against predators by cattle. Then something that few people know, stop using destructive medicine. So even nature organizations with herds and nature areas use deworming medicines, which are really catastrophic for dung beetles, dung flies. So by using these medicines, you destroy actually the whole dung ecosystem, and where natural vegetation provide the same anthelmintics. So there are a lot of weeds that have the same function as chemical deworming medicines without that negative impact. So this is still something to a message to spread among herd managers. And finally, I want to say, if you're interested in this story, organize yourself, and people who are interested in natural grazing, use probably those expert teams on the country level for training programs. We make a Graze Life practitioner's guide. You can find it on the website of Rewilding Europe. at the moment available in 11 languages, where you can, it's a kind of handbook for natural grazing. As I said, in cooperation with national experts, you can really change the thing. As a first result, maybe interesting, since 1.5 years, the European Commission has changed some regulations, which means that agricultural areas that received CAP subsidies in the past and whose land use will be changed for the benefit of Water Framework Directive, Natura 2000, Natura 2000 Habitats and Birds Directive, Biodiversity, or greenhouse reduction, it can still receive direct payments under the first pillar and additional AECM, that's agricultural, climate mitigation payments under the second pillar. That's the new CAP regulation, the article you find below. So again, this is now written down on a European level. It has to be implemented on a national level, and everybody should push his or her national government to adopt this regulation so that you can actually incentivize landowners, land users to change from intensive farming to more natural friendly, sustainable grazing methods. That was it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There we are. Thank you very much, Walter, for that. That's really good. And we have the questions. There are 2 questions, and also, but before I go to the 2 questions that are on the I see in the chat, I would like to quickly go back to Gwyn, because on the basis of the questions that came up after his presentation, when Walter had already started, and the answers he gave, I think it would be useful, Gwyn, if you were to say again to everybody how the data that you showed in your presentation, how it can be accessed, and above all, how it can ought to be used, because there is clearly a demand for it, but there's also a number of obviously a number of concerns that I think need to be made very clear. Gwyn?
Yes, thanks, Anton. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's 2 things, I suppose. So the first one, as I tried to make clear in the very quick presentation, and I apologize for that, is that we know there's errors in it. We know there's things that are not right in it because the data is flawed, or there are things missing in it, or we know that there's wide estimates that the experts have given us, which provides uncertainty of its own. So that's one thing. So that's on the data itself. So we're more than happy to discuss with people the data in that light, and to share the data. That's fine. But we would be very wary of the thing taking on a life of its own, without the caveats and all these things which we would have if we were presenting it. And so I think I'd like if somebody was sharing it, to be making a link back to us and making these caveats clear. And then the second thing, of course, is what these final calculations mean. And so we've estimated very roughly with errors how many livestock are needed. So that's a completely different question to what livestock are there now. You know, so we can be saying, for example, we need 100% of the livestock which are there, and it may be in that country that there's no livestock actually on these semi-natural pastures, or it may be that all the livestock are on the semi-natural pastures, or conversely, there might be too many livestock on the pastures, or a combination of too many in some places and not enough in the other place. So the UK would be or Ireland would be, UK even better than Ireland, would be a case of this, I think. So I think if we were to work out the UK's figures, as I said in my written answer, we haven't done it compared to the total because we then will limit it to the EU and whatever. But we could do it for the UK. And what I suspect we'll find is that the numbers that we think are grazing there will be roughly of the same order as the number we think we need, which will be very different from some other countries. But that's not to say, of course, that they're all appropriately grazing. You know, there may be too many livestock in some areas, and there'll be, as we know, there'll be some areas that have too few livestock. So in lowland England, for example, in small patches, it'll be too few livestock. And so the reason we looked at the total number of livestock was to give us some sort of scale. It's not saying anything more than that. It's just giving some feel of, yeah, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a few thousand cows in a country that has 10 million cows? In which case it has a certain implication for policy, perhaps? Or are we talking about, as in Spain, livestock numbers that are potentially 40% of the total that there is there just now, which is a huge implication. You know, whether the livestock are out there or whether they're not out there, it has a huge implication. You know? So, yeah, I just, you know what data is like. If it gets out there, then it takes a life of its own, and we know that there's uncertainties there, and it's meant to be raising questions, not giving answers for headlines or whatever. You know?
Okay, right. Thank you, Gwyn. Now I'll go to the two questions that we have. The first one is, I'll take this one first. The question is, why is that's for, I think it's for you, Walter. Why is grazing? But anyway, but I would, why is grazing with human-bred ruminants that are not native to Europe considered to be natural grazing? That's kind of a philosophical question here.
Yeah. The question is if you can say the original aurochs went extinct in 1627. The original wild horse, well, of course, there are still some in Mongolia, but there were for millions of years horses and aurochs in the European landscape. So I would not say they are not indigenous. They are just the animals we still have in Europe are. You could, in technical terms, you could say these are the best ecological replacements from their ancestors that went extinct. But compared to doing nothing, it's much better to have these animals now here. So the replacements of the wild horse, the replacements of the aurochs, will do the job better than no animals or sheep, which are really coming from outside Europe. So. I would not say that horse and cattle are not indigenous in Europe. I think they are the best we have, and they are very closely related to the species that went extinct pretty recently in history. I think for 99% they are genetically the same. I know a saying from the Indians in America. They say the grass still remembers the horse. And that's here actually in Europe the same. So the ecosystem still remembers the aurochs and the wild horse, and bringing back tauros, as we call them, primitive breeds or wild horses, is the best we can do from an ecological point of view. So that's my answer on that question.
Yeah, and just to follow up on this quickly, what about like a water buffalo? That's clearly that's an Asian species, for instance, and I've seen other very clearly non-European animals being used in various livestock initiatives, grazing initiatives I've seen in different parts of Europe. So what is your personal opinion about using those kinds of animals?
Yeah, that's a good one. So the water buffalo, also in this part of Europe, they were only left in the Far East. Would they have? They got extinct a long time ago, before the last ice age, but they were coming back from the east, and they entered Eastern Europe, like more or less the fallow deer did. And would they have made it themselves without human help? That's a good question. We will never know, because in the end we helped them to come here. You could. We decided actually at least to bring them back to the Danube Delta, where we think they are really indigenous species. For the rest of Europe, it's a question mark if they would have made it themselves without human help along the Danube towards the Rhine system. But I tend to think that also water buffalo, and fallow deer, in the end, are European species that contribute to European biodiversity.
Okay.
But it's
And
more debatable than horse and cattle. Actually, I don't have any problems with it. It's just the best we have.
Okay, that's clear. And then we have a question, and I think Gwyn, you could perhaps also jump into this one if you happen to know. Somebody is mentioning the Grazed and Confused report from the Food Climate Research Network, Oxford University. Is that familiar to you? And do you see it as being relevant?
I don't know. So maybe somebody can explain a little bit about this, because I don't know it.
I Googled it when it came up because it looked like it was directed at me, but it's some work on the contribution of grazing livestock to carbon, basically, carbon release, etc. So I didn't see it that it was related to my talk, so I didn't answer it. But maybe the contributor could show the relevance or make the relevance. But no is the short answer.
Yeah. When it comes to carbon sequestration, or in the end, of course, carbon storage, because that's what you want, that the carbon is really stored in the soil and in the vegetation, then it's very much depending on the density of animals. In very intensively grazed areas, you have carbon emission in the end, and methane emission. But in naturally extensively grazed areas where the number of animals is not exceeding the carrying capacity of the area, in general, we see net storage of carbon in soil and vegetation. Actually, after peatlands, grazing systems are the systems on Earth that store most carbon, even more than forest areas. And that's in those areas what we call black soils in the world, so or cenozones. It's you have them on the American plains, you have them in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan. Those are areas that are grazed for thousands of years and have continued to actually, with animals that graze the vegetation, and their dung is buried in the soil, and it happens for thousands of years, and they build up the black soils that are the biggest carbon storage in the world after peatlands. So grazing systems, in the end, natural grazing systems really store a lot of carbon because it's sustainably done. It's not, there's no risk of big forest fires in these grazing systems. It's in the end, it's just storing carbon for thousands of years.
I think we have to be careful, I think, to distinguish between stores and sequestration.
Yes.
I agree completely that there are huge carbon stores there. And I agree also with your last point about the management of the risk to those stores, that the risk of them being destroyed by wildfire, for example, or by erosion or whatever, is much less if there's appropriate grazing systems there. Your point about the Chernozems, I think, is really interesting. As I understand it, people don't really understand why the black soil is in the Chernozem. Maybe I misunderstood it. I asked somebody that was a soil scientist, because this question also had arisen in my mind, why the soils are black when they are so full of life. So if you know about that for sure, you can point me to some information. But in general, we would expect, would we not, that soils under stable, unburning, etc., grazing systems, it would be sort of net zero. No, it would be not sequestering, not releasing. I'm very wary of these claims that are made for pastures. Okay, pastures on the former arable fields, of course, it's all increasing. We understand that, but in a stable pasture condition, I'm not sure whether logically we would expect more than an equilibrium. And what I say usually, okay, in the case of Chernozem, it would seem that the answer is there, or I'm not sure whether the science is there. What I would normally say is, well, where is it? If it's been doing it for thousands of years, where is it? Shouldn't it be black by now, And okay, the Chernozem is black.
These are, of course, areas
okay, I'll intervene here. We're going into a very different debate. That's worth a webinar of its own. I have the two more questions. Now, one I will take now because it's a specific question to Wouter. The other one is a more general question. I think I'll take that after we've had Kazimierz at the end in the general debate. But the specific question to Wouter is, have you considered the conflicts of all-year grazing with lower grazing pressure for biodiversity and food production?
Sorry.
Yes, otherwise, this is the question. If it's not clear, maybe you should ask the person who put it to unmute and to explain what is meant. But I'll
Of course,
repeat.
there's less food production on the natural grazed areas than in intensively farmed areas. That's true, and that's so
Yeah.
it's not an alternative for food production. It's, as I said, it's a solution for sustainable nature management, and in addition helps flood risk management. It helps that's all. But for food production, it's just, and as I already said with discussing the wild meat thing, it's just a minor thing, actually, food production.
I think the general point is right. I think if we want to take a holistic view of the agricultural landscape or the landscape, then we have to have a vision for intensive agriculture. We can't escape that. But on the other hand, if I may say so, in the 40 minutes of the presentation or whatever, there was the first bit where you spoke like a Dutchman. You sounded like a Dutchman, you know, very much a kind of naturalistic, let it all go animal. And then you spoke about the report, and the report, you said a lot of things that warmed my heart. So there is this middle, which isn't all in the past tense, as you said it in the first bit, you know, and that bit does produce some food, you know, and it produces some good food and whatever. But the point that the questioner is making is that compared to the total food demand of Europe, of course, that is a small amount. Neither of us can argue with that. Even me, who is more on the agricultural interest than you, maybe, you know.
Well, I'm very much, but of course the food problem is immediately solved if we change from meat consumption to more vegetarian meal. Then we save 30-40% of our European landscape for other things, while producing the same amount of food. So for me, the food discussion is really, in the end, based on, okay, how much meat do we want on our menu? And that's so if we go in that discussion, it's completely another thing. Is, okay, are we ready to change from meat to a more vegetarian menu? And then we solve a lot of problems, I can tell you.
Yeah, it's easier said than done. I mean, I certainly I like my meat and my dairy products. So okay, but let's go on to Kazimier's presentation. Kazimier's, the floor is yours now.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kazimierz Rabski. Well, one thing I would like to add to the previous discussion. Well, we need better food. We need better meat compared to what we are getting from the shop, and that's why I think this is the meat coming from the grazed area, from the natural area. It's quite far more qualified than the other one. So coming back to my presentation. Is kind of the link between what we have been talking about, or you have been talking about, and the reality. So grazing study tour, it will be a good place and good moment to compare in the ground where we are, what kind of activities here we should done on our landscape. The project started quite far ago, because in 2080 we've been talking with Theo Worms, director of the Nature Monument, and what kind of activity which can send together, what kind of common activities will be the most important. And the idea was born that the compared grazing situation in both countries will be very interesting, because of the completely other history of and culture of the grazing and culture of the agriculture, and completely other but very interesting results. So the idea started due to the COVID time. We have been not able to realize this project in time where we're thinking to realize that. So we started this year, and 2022 was the beginning of it. It was a visit to Netherlands, and now is the time to compare and to visit the Polish examples of the idea of this. However, I would like to come back for the completely as a story, just first a kind of the brief. Until 80s in Poland, completely was this impossible to realize the grazing on the protected area due to very strange and very strange of the directions and very strange of the law prescriptions. However, the oldest examples of grazing are connected to the mountains. Everybody, when the Tatra Mountains have a special one from 1981. It was recommended even to Tatra Mountains. Finally, they found that it's a very good result for the biodiversity. One thing more I would like to tell you, between I go to the real situation, is the problem with the culture grazing as a kind of the link to the grazing itself. It was a special recommendation for the Tatra Mountains, but I think that'll be also interesting for the other cultural areas when it must be very connected to the culture, to the traditional methods, even easy traditional methods. Here is some descriptions. I think it's problem of the time, so I don't like to stay on this longer. Maybe during our visit to Poland, I'll tell something about it more. Important historical fact, between I start to describe you our trip. Also important in the scale of the Europe. Walter told us many about the Bulgarian situation. I think there are some similarities connected with the agriculture policy and the agricultural activities in this area. If you look for the map, you've seen how much Polish borders have been changed during the history, and that has a great influence for actually the agricultural culture on the new lands which we have got on the western part of the country after 1945. So it's completely changed the situation compared to the former Poland boundaries, but of course compared to the other European countries. So the large farm of the kolkhoz was the most important for this area of the new land located in the western part of country. So and after the 1989, after the big changes in Poland, a significant amount of post-haste farming was completely abandoned. It is calculated that more than 3 billion hectares has been lost, so it means about 80% of the whole country grounds. Currently, just to inform you, the average size of the farm in Poland is 11 hectares, so it's not much. So it's easier sometimes in the local scale to talk about the biodiversity, even if they are not planned by the farmer himself, but it is important. How? The grazing study, pure, as I said, it was initiated by Naturmonumente, Stadtbosbeheer, and my Society for the Coast, and we wanted just to compare methods, results of grazing, theoretical and practical, and in the similarity of the environmental areas in both countries. So in October 2022, as I mentioned, we've been in the Netherlands, and now it was the first part to comparative study. So we invite you now to participate in touring North and West Poland in September. So in 3 weeks, 26 to 29. The tour will include the visit to different nature reserves, each with absolutely unique nature management activities. So you have a possibility to learn more, not only about the aspects of the grazing, but also to the relation to the economical situation in actual Poland, the chance for the other, as a tourism, as a recreation, but also as a looking for the very good practice in collaboration between the specialists from the other countries. So it's always better, in my opinion, to see in the ground, but not only looking on the screen, what we are now used after the COVID. So Planet Road, because we have a very limited time, we decided to show you the 3 areas which various type of the grazing or various type of the using the grazing and the result. The first are the Warta Mouse National Park. The second will be Odra Delta Nature Park, and the third will be Worin National Park. 3 big areas located on the estuary and the catchment of Odra River, very characteristic for this part of Poland. So if you look for the map, very easy map, just make it. There are 3 points. Down is the mouth of Warta River National Parks. The second one, the small one, is Odra Delta Nature Park, and the other is the Wolyński National Park. Well, 3 places with various things of the point of interest. During the trip, of course, we will get more knowledge about the places itself, but I think it's very important to know that mouth of Warta is one of the most interesting area in Poland connected with the bird life, because there are 270 species of bird, which 170 is breeding here. And the problem is that is the kind of the triangle between the big rivers and the annual water fluctuation may reach up to 4 meters. So it's very different, very divided area because of the very depend of the meteorological climatic situation. 8,000 hectares, beautiful meadows, which has been used for the agriculture even before the war and even Middle Ages, but we don't know about the details about it. During the period of during the communist time, the state grazed here 3,000 to 4,000 heads of the cows. Then for a couple of years, that land was completely abandoned, and the park, regional park, and before started to repeat the cows for about 500 cows in 1995. Well, since the establishing of the park, the grazing cows and horses up to 5,000. I think it will be very interesting to see how it can be shared with the economical aspects and with the nature and education aspects. And that is one of the most important points, very often visited by the many people, and also very good example about the economic development. The second area is completely the other one, because it's a private land, belongs to Society for the Coast, which I established in 1995. And in 2005, we established Odra Delta Nature Park. When here the grazing can be a little tool for nature management, and we are using the conic horses and the Scottish Highlanders cows, which has an all-year ground and makes a very good result connected with the biodiversity. Here is not focused for any economic development at the now, but now they have a very good example for many scientific observation, but also for many big attraction for the tourism, especially the conic horses, which are absolutely the point of interest for many people. Many weddings are going here because of the horses. That's a good luck. So the only need we now is because the horses and animals had a little too good conditions. So we will talk about how to spread these animals, and there's a still idea to cooperate with the National Park of Mouth of Warta National Park to give them 100 kettles because it's really a little too high now. And about the density, we'll be talking in the area because according to the regulations or according to the good practice, the middle density is about 0.5 animal per hectare, which is, in my opinion, after the 20 years of experience, to be discussion about. But I think that it's for longer discussion. But it depends for year to year change of weather situation, of the environment situation. So it's not a strict line we should have taken. Well, the third place we would like to show you is this absolutely unique Wolyński National Park, a park which is established on the 60s in the water area of Lagoon, Szczecin Lagoon, and the sea, which absolutely unique in Europe, beach forest, and absolutely unique in Europe, back delta island connected with the catchment of the Odra River and the fluence of the Baltic Sea. And that is the part when they started to be realized the grazing after the long break. Well, the historical data says that this island, small island, has been grazed in 16th century, occasionally grazed after Second World War, and again come to the grazing in 1994. So since 2000, there's a real contract between the park directors and the farmers, and that depends of the situation, up to 500 kettles on the 300 50 hectares. It's a pity that's only cows, but it's also depending on the possibilities, economic possibilities, and the interest of the owners of the owners of the animals. So what we are going to discuss during these 3 days, and also I think will be very helpful to today's discussion and today's remarks. First, we must take into consideration historical background, the background which creates the actual situation and actual possibilities. The second is how we can compare in European scale, what also has been mentioned, but my colleague, management organization, what we can improve, what we can implement together, what are the specific for the region, because there are many specific situations connected with degrading up to the region, up to the climate condition, up to the historical aspects. Of course, natural and ecological effects, not disputable, they are quite big, but also there's something new also mentioned in previous presentation, the economic aspects, how we can share the nature management aspect with economic. Of course, for many areas, like the coastal areas of the park, the Mausovarta National Park and the Society for the Coast Area, education and tourism, there's a great chance, but this great chance gives also the chance for social interaction. How we can interest the local people to treat this kind of tool for nature management as attraction, as a local possibility income. That's something what we are trying to do, and we find many people, many local people who are starting to be interested how we can use this tool for nature conservancy for the income in the small scale. And I think that'll be something what we'll be very looking forward to your participation, and tell us something about it more from your countries. So the grazing study tour is still open to you, 26th to 29th of September, and if registration are still possible, to have a large discussion about this fantastic subject, which grazing is, what I'm working for more than 20 years. By Eurosite is our very, very good umbrella for doing that. So, and the project is organized by, under the LIFE project and in Eurosite, of course, my society, Naturmonument and Stadtbosbeher. So, thank you very much. I got 10 minutes. I've used 12 minutes. Sorry for that. And you'll be more than welcome in 3 weeks. In Polish, dziękuję. Będziecie mile widziani za 3 tygodnie. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, dziękuję, Kazimierz. That was very good and to the point. And
Great,
so please, if you haven't registered and you want to join the study tour, do so now. The link is available on the Eurosite web pages. And
if I can add something, and that is the first, I think, example in European scale that people from many countries could compare two countries not located each by each, but it's still distance about 1,000 kilometers, but how many differences and how many similarities we have. So you are more than welcome again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have less than 10 minutes left. So as said, the registration, you go to the Eurosite web pages and look for events. And there you are. There's a link is there too. Leave that, I think we'll leave that slide open for people who want to take notes or copy it or photo, take a picture. Okay, we have two, I suppose, questions. I also have a comment. One question, it's a question from myself as from the Agriculture, Biodiversity, Climate Work Group, and it links up to what a remark from one of the attendees. It's this one here. So, Walter, the kind of grazing, semi-wild grazing, if you like to call it that you were explaining, the landscapes look extremely attractive, I must say. But from a point of view of delivering food, even high quality meat and milk products and wool from extensive grazing, I mean, their output is not very large, and that's a remark that's also in the chat, that the amount of product is very small and hardly a drop in the ocean. So, and my question really is kind of linked to that. If I was a landowner and I have a lot of land with a lot of these habitats and ecosystems that where your grazing would do a lot of wonders, you know, with all these semi-wild animals, why would I want to do it from an economic point of view? I mean, is it still possible to generate an income from that by selling, for instance, high quality meat from various, that has a high quality and is animal welfare and is good for nature and is good for carbon, all the rest of it? Or is there some other reason why I, as a landowner, would want to do that? Well, what will you tell me as a landowner?
Yeah, good question. So, as I said in my presentation, meat is a very small product coming out of natural grazing, and economically, it's just a minor thing compared to other benefits we can get from natural grazing. Having said that, there's also not a blueprint for natural grazing on every place in Europe. So it depends very much on where you are situated with your land, if you what your contribution could be from also an economic perspective. And food is really maybe the last thing you should think of when you start natural grazing. So yeah, as I said, in some areas you could make the economic deal with clay mining. In other areas it could be making a combination with the drink water company to clean up their water instead of cleaning it afterwards with the chemicals, whatever. I'm now busy in the United States with a project which has a scale that we think that carbon sequestration could be a more interesting source of income than cattle breeding, actually bringing much more money in the business than the selling of meat. So it depends on where you are situated with your land, the scale you're dealing with, what the business model could be. And again, definitely there will be only a few situations where you can really make a reasonable income from meat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. That's clear. And now I'll go, because time is running out, I want to take the other question. And that's a question to all four of you. It really goes to this is a very critical question, in fact, and I shall read it out. I find this overselling of holistic grazing as the cure-all for all our biodiversity, climate change, water retention problems a huge risk, because the equation just does not work. Would there not be other potentially better alternatives to grazing that would also be better than doing nothing? In other words, can we do something that's not grazing and to achieve these results? Which of you four would like to answer that one, or at least make a start?
Well, the reason that we were successful in the Netherlands, later on in Europe, and that we are now busy in the United States is because we really create a better alternative for original technical solutions that are often more expensive. But again, it's not a solution for solution for everything. It's just in specific situations, nature could be an ally in solving socioeconomic issues. And talking about nature, very often on terrestrial landscape, herbivory is an important process. You can't exchange herbivores by mowing machines. They have their own. So it's just recognizing within an ecosystem the role of herbivores, but it could also be other ecological processes. But there is no cheap alternative for natural grazing when you look at an ecosystem, and there are sometimes cheaper answers on socioeconomic issues without grazing. It's just to recognize that in several cases, and we have now hundreds of examples all over the world, we show that nature could be a solution and that herbivory is part of that nature. Not less and not more than that. It's not a solution for everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a shame we have anonymous attendees asking questions, actually. I think they should say who they are. But I noticed the anonymous attendee doesn't give a suggestion of an alternative. And so, although Wouter and myself, we don't come from necessarily the same background, I would agree with what he says, really, that even in the case of these Annex 1 habitats that are in the Haladalis, it seems that we have an area the size of Germany. So these problems have a scale, without talking even about the intensively managed land or the non-Halada habitats that are semi-natural. And so what is the alternative that manages risk for us, because that's what the question implies, isn't it? That there's a high risk if we go down the extensive livestock route, whether it's rewilded livestock or whether it's livestock in still agricultural systems. Okay, so if that's high risk, with the opportunity it has for managing habitats and giving some water quality benefits and fire risk management, all that kind of, if that's high risk, so what's the low risk then? That's what I would ask anonymous attendee. You know, give us a suggestion and then we can knock it down or we can agree with it. But as Wouter says, it seems the obvious lowest cost solution just now. And it's what the habitats in Europe have grown up with since the Ice Age in some form or other. So what's the alternative? The question seems to state it as if it's obvious that there is one, but I'm not clear what it is.
Okay, Kazimierz?
Well, in my opinion, every method which we are going to improve the situation of the nature is important. Even at the large scale or in the small scale, it depends, of course, of the local situation, but also looking for the global situation. But if we start from the local situation, that will spread to the globalizer. So my opinion is that if we are using any method which can be improved to the situation, large on it, that are important. So that's an easier question, I think so.
Good. Well, it's now exactly, we're just gone 3 o'clock, so I think we have to put an end to it. I'm going to end by reading out a comment. It's not a question, but a comment, and I think it's a very nice comment to end on. It's not from an anonymous attendee. It's from a named attendee, and if I read it out, we'll go into the recording. And this is a nice note to end on, and so I quote, "I think it's important to recognize that good nature management requires a diverse group of stakeholders, and that farmers, shepherds, herd managers, hunters, etc. are a part of that management. As Wouter pointed out in his talk, we can have good nature management using wild herbivores and also support the local stakeholders and economy. It may have been environmentalists versus farmers in the past, but this is no longer the case. We can work together for the benefit of nature and the ecosystem services that provide our modern societies with vital support. I am very excited to learn more about Graze Life and to help to do what I can here in Germany or throughout the EU to help realize the recommendations from the report. Thank you for your talks." So that's a nice note to end on. It means that we've had an impact. And so that's the whole point of these webinars. And I think I will now simply conclude by thanking everybody, the speakers, of course, and also you, the attendees, for being here on such a lovely sunny afternoon. And hope to meet you either in Poland in the grazing study tour, so don't forget to register, or at one of our future webinars. And so wishing you all the best, and bye.
Thank you very much. All the very best to all of you.